facial expressions of emotion influence memory for facial identity in an automatic way. Doug and Bow, University of Liège, and Linden, University of Geneva. Previous studies indicate that the encoding of new facial identities in memory is influenced by the type of expression displayed by the faces. In the current study, the authors investigated whether or not this influence requires attention to be explicitly directed towards the effective meaning of facial expressions. In a first experiment, the authors found that facial identity was better recognized when the faces were initially encountered with a happy rather than an angry expression, even when attention was oriented toward facial features other than expression. Using the remember no guess paradigm in a second experiment, the authors found that the influence of facial expressions on the conscious recollection of facial identity was even more pronounced when participants' attention was not directed towards expressions. It is suggested that the effective meaning of facial expressions automatically modulates the encoding of facial identity in memory. Introduction. The influence of emotional memory has been abundantly demonstrated using various types of materials, including complex real life events, events depicted in film, clips, or slideshows, and lists of words or pictures. By contrast, although facial expressions of emotions are among the most important sources of social information, their effects on memory have been relatively neglected. Moreover, existing studies have led to contradictory findings, with some studies showing an enhanced memory for positive, happy, relative to negative, sad, angry, fearful, and slash or neutral faces in non-depressed and non-anxious individuals. Whereas other studies found a better memory for faces with negative rather than positive or neutral expressions. Findings from these studies are unclear, however, with regard to which specific features of the stimuli contributed to memory performance, because exactly the same photos were used at study and test. Performance may have depended as much on remembering pictorial details, for instance, details of the lightning, grain, and flaws of a particular photo, as it did on remembering the faces depicted. Furthermore, although facial identity and expression are probably not processed completely independently, there is nevertheless some separation between the coding of these two types of facial information. Yet, the memory measures used in the above mentioned studies were not able to distinguish between memory for facial identity and memory for expressions. Considering these issues, we have recently developed a task that assesses memory for facial identity and memory for facial expression separately, while avoiding letting pictorial details contribute to memory performance. At study, faces are presented with either a happy or an angry expression. At test, these faces are shown with a neutral expression, intermixed with new neutral faces. Participants are asked to recognize facial identity, for instance, old new discrimination. And when a face is judged as old, they also have to report which expression the face had at study, for instance, happy or angry. Using this task, we found that facial identity was better recognized when faces had displayed a happy rather than an angry expression at study. And this was due to enhancement of the conscious recollection of facial identity rather than feelings of familiarity. With regard to memory for facial expression, the results were less consistent across studies, with some studies showing a better memory for positive than negative expressions, and other studies finding no difference. This overview suggests that the encoding of facial information in memory, and in particular facial features used to identify a person, is influenced by the type of expression displayed by the faces, with people having a better memory for the identity of faces that were initially encountered with a happy rather than an angry expression. This influence of facial expression could be explained by several factors, including differences in the perceptual features of different types of facial expressions or differences in their social/emotional meaning. In terms of low level physical features, there is evidence that happy and neutral expressions are more dissimilar to each other than angry and neutral expressions. However, our finding that neutral faces were better recognized when they had previously displayed happy rather than angry expressions is difficult to explain entirely in terms of these differences in low level physical features. It has indeed been found that larger changes in the appearance of a face, for example, changes in expression or pose, between study and test, result in poorer recognition. Consequently, an explanation in terms of the low level physical features of the expressions would predict that neutral faces should be less well recognized when they had displayed happy rather than angry expressions at study, the opposite of our finding. Because modifications in the physical appearance of the faces due to the change in expression between study and test, for instance, from happy or angry to neutral, were presumably greater for happy expressions than for angry expressions. The influence of facial expressions may result from their social/emotional meaning rather than their perceptual features. Facial expressions are powerful sources of social information, which enable viewers to quickly infer the feelings and intentions of others, including the liking and approval expressed by happy expressions or the hostility expressed by angry expressions. Presumably, as a result of the potential costs associated with failing to notice threatening stimuli, negative facial expressions attract attention more effectively than positive ones and tend to disrupt the processing of other irrelevant information. Interestingly, it has been found that negative expressions interfere more than positive expressions with the ability to process local features of the faces. Negative facial expressions may therefore attract attention to themselves at the expense of other facial features, including those used to recognize the identity of a person. Conversely, there is evidence that positive facial expressions are processed faster than negative expressions, so that encounters with faces with positive expressions may leave more processing resources available to process facial identity. The influence of facial expressions on memory for a facial identity may therefore result from the disruptive effects of angry expressions and slash or facilitative effects of happy expressions on the processing of facial identity. The role of social/emotional meaning attributed to facial expressions is further emphasized by findings that the influence of expressions on memory for facial identity is modulated by individual differences in social information processing, such as social anxiety and delusional ideation. Existing studies, therefore, converge to suggest that the social/emotional meaning of facial expression influences the encoding of new facial identities in memory, with memory for facial identity being better when the faces were encoded with a happy rather than an angry expression. The purpose of the present study was to investigate whether this memory advantage for happy faces over angry faces depends on the type of facial information that is attended to when encoding the faces in memory. To show a bias towards remembering faces that had displayed a particular type of expression, facial expression must have been processed, at least minimally, so that it can influence the encoding of facial identity in memory. However, such processing of facial expression and its influence on memory for facial identity may occur relatively automatically. That is, without paying explicit attention to the emotional meaning of the facial expression. There is evidence that emotion influences memory for words and pictures, even when the effective charge of the stimuli is not explicitly rated. But it is not known whether this is also the case with regard to memory for facial information. The purpose of this study was precisely to examine this issue. In a first experiment, we compared the influence of happy and angry expressions on memory for facial identity and memory for facial expression when participants made judgments about facial expression versus judgments about facial features unrelated to expression. In a second experiment, we used the remember, no, guess paradigm to further investigate which memory processes are influenced by facial expressions. In previous studies, we found that the effect of facial expressions on identity memory was specifically due to differences in remember responses, suggesting that expressions modulate elaborative processing operations during the encoding of facial identity. In experiment 2, we aimed at investigating whether this influence differs as a function of whether or not facial expression is explicitly assessed. In addition, considering possible interactions between the processing of facial expression and direction of gaze, another goal of our second experiment was to explore whether the influence of expressions on identity memory is modulated by the direction of facial display. Experiment 1. The purpose of our first experiment was to investigate whether the influence of facial expressions on memory for facial identity and expression differs as a function of whether or not attention is directed toward their effective meaning. Participants were presented with faces displaying a happy or an angry expression and were oriented to process some specific aspects of the faces. A first group of participants had to rate the intensity of the expressions displayed, whereas participants from two other groups made judgments about features unrelated to facial expression. Some participants had to infer trait information, for instance, intelligence, from the faces, while other participants had to judge a physical feature of the faces, for instance, nose size. Memory for facial identity and facial expression was then assessed for all participants. On the basis of studies that assess the influence of emotion on memory for words or pictures, we predicted that the influence of facial expressions on memory would be apparent even when participants' attention is not explicitly oriented towards facial expression. In addition, we expected that memory for facial identity would be better following judgments about trait information, intelligence, than following judgments about a physical feature, nose size. Nevertheless, if the influence of facial expressions on memory for facial identity occurs automatically, the difference in memory performance between happy and angry faces should be similar following these two types of judgments. Method. Participants in design. A total of 72 undergraduate students, 34 women, 38 men, at the University of Geneva volunteered to participate. The experiment consisted of a 3 encoding condition, expression, intelligence, nose size, versus 2 facial expression, happy, angry. Mixed model design with encoding condition as a between participants factor and expression as a within participants factor. 24 participants were allocated at random to each encoding condition. Data from two participants belonging to the intelligence condition had to be discarded due to problems with response recording. Materials. Stimuli were selected from the Karolinska Directed Emotional Faces, KDEF. This carefully controlled database includes faces that had been photographed from the same distance with the background of the pictures, the lighting conditions, and the clothes worn by the individuals portrayed being identical over all pictures. Pictures of 24 individuals, 12 males and 12 females, were selected with each individual being portrayed with three different expressions: neutral, happy, and angry. In all pictures, face orientation was directed, facing forward. 16 faces were presented at study, 8 with happy expressions and 8 with angry expressions. And the remaining 8 faces were used as distractors for the memory test. Faces used as studied or non studied items were counterbalanced across participants. Each studied face was seen with a happy expression by half the participants and with an angry expression by the other half, thus ensuring that the effect of facial expression was not confounded by differences in the memorability of particular facial identities. Procedure: participants were tested individually. They were told that the study was part of a research program investigating the perception of facial information and that their task would be to make judgments about faces. In the intelligence condition, participants were asked to rate the extent to which the persons depicted looked intelligent using a 3 point scale: 1, not at all; 2, moderately; 3, very intelligent. In the nose condition, participants were asked to rate the extent to which the person depicted had a smaller or bigger nose than average, also using a 3 point scale, with 1 being smaller, 2 being average, and 3 being bigger. In these two encoding conditions, no mention was made of the emotional expressions of the faces. By contrast, in the expression condition, participants were told that faces with happy or angry expressions would be presented and that their task was to rate the intensity of each facial expression using a 3 point scale, 1 being low, 2 being moderate, and 3 being high. Participants were not informed of the subsequent memory tests in any of the three conditions. The faces were sequentially presented in a random order on the computer screen approximately 60 centimeters in front of the participants. Each face was presented for 5 seconds, during which participants made their judgment by pressing the appropriate response key. After all the faces had been presented, participants performed a distraction task for 1 minute, and then they received the instructions for the memory test. They were told that they would see a series of faces, some of which represented people they had been shown initially, although their facial expressions would be different. All the faces were neutral. For each face, they had to decide whether or not they had seen this person before. Facial identity recognition. By pressing the appropriate response key: 1, presented, or 2, not presented. In addition, when participants claimed to recognize a face, they were asked to report which expression the face had displayed at study: 1, happy, or 2, angry. The 24 neutral faces were presented in random order, and the memory task was self paced. After completing the memory task, participants were asked to explain what they thought the purpose of the experiment was. None of them guessed in advance that their memory for the faces would be tested. Participants were then debriefed and thanked for their participation. Results: facial identity recognition. The mean proportion of hits for facial identity recognition are shown in Figure 1 as a function of the expression faces had displayed at study: happy versus angry. In the encoding task, judgments for expression, intelligence, or nose. Since all faces that were presented at test had a neutral expression, false alarms could not be calculated separately for happy and angry faces. The mean proportion of FAs were 0.17, 0.22, and 0.17 in the expression, intelligence, and nose condition, respectively. There was no significant difference between the three conditions. A 2 facial expression versus 3 encoding task analysis of variance on the proportions of hits yielded a significant main effect of facial expression, showing that facial identity was better recognized when faces had displayed a happy rather than an angry expression at study. The main effect of encoding task was also significant. This revealed that facial identity was better recognized when faces had been rated for intelligence or expression as compared to nose. There was no significant difference between the intelligence and expression conditions. There was no interaction between facial expression and encoding task. Memory for facial expression. Memory for facial expression was assessed by determining the possibility that a participant correctly recalled a facial expression conditionalized upon correct facial identity recognition. This was done by dividing the number of correct responses for each type of expression, happy versus angry, by the number of correct identity recognitions for that type of expression. Mean proportions are shown in Figure 2 as a function of the type of expression and encoding task. A2, facial expression versus 3, encoding task, and NOVA yielded a significant main effect of encoding task. Facial expression was better recalled by participants who had judged expression at study than by participants who had judged intelligence or nose size. There was no difference between the intelligence and nose conditions. The main effect of facial expression was not significant, nor was the interaction between expression and encoding task. Discussion. Faces that had displayed a happy expression at study were better recognized than faces that had displayed an angry expression, both for participants who explicitly processed the effective meaning of facial expressions and for participants who process facial features unrelated to expression. These findings support the idea that the influence of expression on memory for facial identity occurs automatically in the sense that it does not require to pay explicitly attention to the emotional meaning of expressions. For participants who process features other than expression, recognition performance was higher following judgments about trait information than following judgments about a specific physical feature, which is consistent with previous studies that investigate the effects of learning instructions on face recognition. Nevertheless, despite this general effect of learning instructions, the influence of facial expressions was equivalent for participants who judged trait information and participants who judged a physical feature. This finding is also consistent with the view that expression influenced memory for facial identity in an automatic way. With regard to memory for facial expression, we found that paying explicit attention to facial expression resulted in better memory performance, which suggests that facial expressions themselves are not encoded automatically in memory. Furthermore, contrary to what was observed for facial identity, there was no significant difference between memory for happy and angry expressions, whatever the encoding condition. As we have already mentioned, previous studies that compared memory for positive versus negative facial expressions have led to conflicting findings, with some studies showing a better memory for positive than negative expressions, and other studies finding no difference. Although the reasons for these inconsistencies remain to be investigated in detail, they might be explained, at least in part, by individual differences between the participants included in the different studies, in particular regarding psychopathological dimensions such as social anxiety. Experiment 2. Our first experiment indicates that facial expressions influence memory for facial identity even when participants' attention is oriented toward facial features other than expression. In a second experiment, we aim to replicate this finding and to further explore the memory processes on which it's based. When people report that they have encountered someone before, their recognition may be accompanied by subjective experience of remembering the previous encounter or only by a feeling of familiarity. Using the remember know paradigm to assess these subjective experiences, we had previously found that the influence of facial expressions on memory for facial identity was due to differences in remember rather than know responses. Since remember responses are sensitive to elaborative and distinctive processing operations during encoding, these findings suggest that facial identity is processed more elaborately and distinctively when faces display happy rather than angry expressions. In experiment 2, we investigated whether the influence of facial expressions on remember responses differs as a function of whether or not facial expression is explicitly assessed at encoding. Another goal of experiment 2 was to explore whether the influence of facial expressions on memory for facial identity differs as a function of the direction of facial display. There is evidence that direct, as opposed to averted, gaze captures attention and enhances memory for facial identity. Furthermore, gaze direction seems to modulate the processing of facial expression. In particular, it has been found that direct gaze enhances the processing of facially communicated approach oriented emotions, such as anger and joy, whereas averted Gaze enhances the processing of facially communicated avoidance oriented emotion, such as fear and sadness. Consequently, the influence of happy and angry expressions might be more pronounced when these expressions are directed towards the observer rather than averted. To investigate this possibility, one group of participants in experiment 2 was presented with directed happy and angry faces, whereas another group was presented with averted faces. In both groups, half of the participants were asked to judge the intensity of facial expression, whereas the other half made judgments about inferred trait information, for instance, intelligence. Method: participants and design. A total of 80 undergraduate students, 50 women, 30 men, at the University of Liège volunteered to participate. The experiment consisted of a two encoding condition, expression versus intelligence, versus two face orientation, directed versus averted, versus two facial expression, happy versus angry, mixed model design with encoding condition and face orientation as between participants factors, and facial expression as a within participants factor. 20 participants were allocated at random to each group. Materials and procedure. The stimuli were the same as those used in Experiment 1, except for participants in the averted face condition. For this condition, we used pictures that portrayed exactly the same individuals as in Experiment 1, also with happy, angry, or neutral expressions, but whose faces were oriented 45 degrees to the right instead of being oriented towards the observer. Both eyes and the whole mouth were clearly visible, and eye gaze was congruent with facial orientation. The procedure was similar to experiment 1, with the following modifications. First, at study, the faces were presented for 4 seconds instead of 5. This was done because most ratings, 93% for intelligence and expression in experiment 1, were made in less than 4 seconds. And we wanted to minimize the possibility that once they had finished rating each face, participants would process facial features other than the one they were asked to attend to. Second, in the test phase, states of awareness associated with facial identity recognition were assessed with the remember, know, guess paradigm. Detailed instructions about remember, know, and guess responses were provided based on those used by Gardner and Richardson 2000. In short, participants were told that a remember response should be given to any face which at the time it was recognized brought back to mind something they had consciously experienced. For example, an association, a thought, a feeling, at the time it was presented. In contrast, they were asked to make a no response if the face felt familiar, but they were unable to recollect any details about its prior presentation. Finally, they were asked to make a guess response if they were unsure whether or not the face had been presented at study. Memory for facial expression was not assessed. Results: the mean proportions of overall recognition, remember, know, and guess responses are presented in Table 1 as a function of encoding task, facial expression, and face orientation. Separate 2, encoding task, versus 2, facial expression, versus 2, face orientation. ANOVAs were carried out for overall recognition and for remember, know, and guess responses. With regard to the overall recognition, there was a main effect of facial expression, showing that faces that had displayed a happy expression at study were better recognized than faces that had displayed an angry expression. All other main effects and interactions were not significant. An analysis of total amount of false alarms did not review any significant effect of encoding condition or facial orientation, nor was there any interaction between these two factors. For remember responses, the ANOVA yielded a significant effect of facial expression, a significant effect of encoding task, and a significant interaction between facial expression and encoding task. As illustrated in Figure 3, in the intelligence condition, remember responses were more frequent for faces that had displayed a happy expression than for faces that had displayed an angry expression, whereas there was no difference between the two types of faces in the expression condition. All other main effects and interactions were not significant. The ANOVA for no responses did not yield any significant main effect or interaction. With regard to gas responses, there was a significant effect of encoding, showing that participants in the expression condition produced more gas responses than participants in the intelligence condition. Finally, analysis of remember knowing gas false alarms did not reveal any significant effect of encoding condition or facial orientation, nor was there any interaction between these two factors. Discussion. With regard to total recognition performance, the results of experiment 2 replicate those of experiment 1, showing equivalent recognition performance following judgments of trait information and judgments of facial expression, and better recognition of happy faces than of angry faces in both conditions. However, examining the states of awareness associated with memory revealed that facial identity recognition was more frequently associated with remember responses and less frequently associated with guess responses, following judgments about intelligence than following judgments about expression. In addition, remember responses were more frequent for happy than for angry faces, following judgments about intelligence but not following judgments about expression. Insofar as remember responses reflect more elaborate and distinctive processing operations at encoding, these findings suggest first that rating expression reduced elaborative processing of facial identity compared to rating intelligence, and second, that facial identity was processed more elaborately for happy than angry faces when facial stimuli were rated for intelligence, but not when they were rated for expression. A possible explanation of these findings is that explicitly orienting attention towards facial expression facilitates the encoding of this information in memory. See experiment 1. But disrupts elaborative encoding of facial identity, therefore resulting in a global decrease in remember responses that supersedes the influence facial expression otherwise has on these responses. See the general discussion section for further discussion of this issue. In any case, the findings clearly indicate that the influence of facial expressions on memory for facial identity does not require explicit assessment of the effective meaning of the expressions. On the contrary, explicit rating of facial expressions may even reduce their impact on the conscious recollection of facial identity. Insofar as direct, as opposed to averted, gaze enhances the processing of facial expressions of joy and anger, we expected to find a more pronounced influence of these expressions when they were directed towards the observer rather than averted. However, the influence of expressions on identity memory was not modulated by facial orientation. This might simply indicate that gaze orientation and facial expression do not interact to influence the encoding of facial identity in memory. However, it should be emphasized that we manipulated eye gaze as a component of the direction of the whole face display, whereas most studies that demonstrated an influence of gaze direction manipulated eye gaze while keeping the orientation of the whole face constant. Using stimuli similar to those used in the present experiment, Juf et al. 2005 found that the influence of facial expressions on attention was not modulated by facial orientation. However, as pointed out by these authors, two factors are confounded in these stimuli: the orientation of the gaze and the orientation of the whole face. Therefore, studies that disentangle these two factors should be conducted before definitely concluding that gaze orientation and facial expression do not interact to influence the encoding of facial identity in memory. General discussion. The main goal of this study was to assess the influence of facial expressions on memory for new facial identities and to investigate whether this influence varies according to the types of facial information that are attended to when encoding the faces in memory. When encountering unfamiliar persons, a wealth of useful social signals can be derived from their faces, including information about their sex, age, and forward personality traits, intentions, and emotions, and information used to encode their identity. During a social encounter, one may favor the processing of one type of facial information over another, which has consequences for the efficiency of the encoding of different types of facial information in memory. Previous studies have, for instance, shown that instructions to attend to specific aspects of facial stimuli, such as personality traits, gender, or physical feature, have considerable effects on memory for facial identity. We replicated these findings in Experiment 1, showing that identity recognition is better following judgments about trait information than judgments about a physical feature. Despite this overall difference in both encoding conditions, faces were better recognized when they had previously displayed happy rather than angry expressions. Furthermore, the influence of facial expressions in these two conditions was equivalent to the influence observed when participants' attention was explicitly directed towards facial expression. On the whole, these findings support the conclusion that facial expressions influence memory for facial identity in a relatively automatic manner, that is, without requiring the explicit assessment of the effective meaning of the expressions. The examination of states of awareness associated with facial identity recognition in Experiment 2 suggests that the explicit rating of facial expressions may even reduce their impact on the conscious recollection of facial identity. Indeed, identity recognition was more frequently associated with remember responses for happy faces than for angry faces when the stimuli had been rated for the trait information at encoding, but not when they were rated for facial expressions. The lack of influence of facial expression in the latter condition seemed to result from a decrease in remember responses following judgments about facial expression compared to judgments of trait information. These findings are particularly interesting because remember responses are probably more sensitive than overall recognition performance to differences in elaborative and distinctive processing that occurred at encoding. The results, therefore, suggest that explicitly attending to facial expression enhanced memory for this facial information. See Experiment 1. But disrupted elaborative processing of facial identity, which may have superseded the impact facial expressions otherwise have on the elaboration of facial identity processing. The influence of facial expressions observed when attention was not explicitly oriented towards expression may reflect that a spontaneous implementation in different processing strategies in response to the encounter of angry versus happy faces. When attention is not explicitly oriented toward facial expression, people may spontaneously focus on facial expression to a greater extent when being confronted with angry faces than with happy faces. This would result in a reduced elaboration of facial identity, similar to what is observed when attention is explicitly oriented towards facial expression. As already noted, there is indeed evidence that threatening stimuli such as faces with angry expressions attract attention to themselves and disrupt the processing of other expression relevant information. Conversely, people typically view others as sources of reward and expect positive interactions, which may facilitate the processing of positive social signals, such as those conveyed by facial expressions, and hence leave more resources available for processing other social cues, such as facial identity. Different types of facial expressions may therefore spontaneously orient processing resources to different types of facial information, with angry expressions orienting attention predominantly to the expressions themselves, whereas positive expressions enable the processing of a wider variety of facial features, including those used to recognize a person's identity. The reduced conscious recollection of the identity of faces that had displayed an angry expression might thus reflect a spontaneous constriction of the focus of attention toward threatening expressions themselves, which perturbs elaborative encoding and hence the conscious recollection of facial identity. This hypothesis could be tested in future studies by measuring visual scan paths during the encoding of faces displaying happy versus angry expressions, and by examining relationships between these measures and subsequent memory for facial identity. As a final point, it should be noted that it is likely that, at least for some trials, participants had enough time to process facial features other than the one they were asked to attend to, even though we decreased presentation time of the faces in experiment 2 to minimize this possibility. In fact, we were inclined to believe that, insofar as happy and angry expressions tend to increase or decrease the elaboration of facial identity processing, reducing the possibility of elaboration by using very short presentation times might diminish the influence of facial expressions. If it was indeed the case, it would indicate that the influence of expressions on memory for facial identity is not automatic in a strong sense, for instance, independent of top down factors, but corresponds instead to the notion of weak automaticity, which refers to task irrelevant or involuntary processing. In summary, the present experiments replicate previous findings that faces are better recognized when they have previously been encountered with happy rather than angry expressions, and they further indicate that this influence of facial expressions does not require explicit assessment of the effective meaning of expressions. On the contrary, enhanced conscious recollection of the identity of happy faces compared to angry faces was apparent only when attention was not oriented toward the affective meaning of expressions. We suggest that, in the latter condition, angry faces tend to spontaneously orient attention to facial expressions themselves, which disrupt elaborative encoding and enhance conscious recollection of facial identity. More generally, this interpretation fits well with proposals that negative stimuli tend to constrict the breadth of attention toward indices of threat, whereas positive stimuli tend to broaden the breadth of attention. Our findings could reflect the memory consequences of such a modulation of attentional scope in response to the encounter of balanced social signals.